So back in this video, I talked about how to decide whether or not writing your novel from the point of view of multiple protagonists is the right call. So let's say you've made that decision. Today, we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty details of writing a multi-POV book. Specifically, I want to answer these questions left in the comments by Alice and Ayuki. How to switch scenes and switch POVs without sounding awkward, and addressing characters by name in the narration and how that might change depending on whose head you're actually in. And I want to stop and say that part again. Whose head are you actually in? Because just like back in this video about the difference between head hopping and omniscient point of view, that's the question that's going to guide you through this process. Who is your narrator? One simple thing you can do right off the bat is to give each POV character their own chapter. When a reader reaches a new chapter, she expects a change. And in multi-POV books, that includes the POV change. It can also help create a real page turner when every chapter ends with a reveal or a question or even a cliffhanger, and then we switch to another protagonist's POV, but we can't wait to get back to that POV. If you need to switch POVs in the middle of a chapter, first of all, you definitely need a scene break. By that I mean literally an extra line of space or an asterisk, anything to give the reader a visual clue that that scene has ended and this new one has begun and there's a new perspective. Second of all, there should be movement. As in, maybe there's a new setting, or there's a time jump, or the characters are going from point A to point B. If you switch POVs mid-scene without a time jump and without changing settings, that's dangerously close to head hopping. But that said, I can think of some instances where this could actually work. For example, let's say you're writing a big tense scene in an interrogation room between a detective and a suspect. You're writing in the detective's point of view, and she's pretty positive this suspect is the murderer she's been looking for, but she's not quite sure yet. So this scene is all about her pulling out all her tricks, trying to get him to confess. And it works. The suspect cracks and confesses to the murder. But then we switch POVs. We're in the suspect's head. He's watching this detective gleefully take down his statement of confession. And through his internal narration, we learn that he's actually innocent, but something the detective said made him realize that the real murderer is his daughter. We didn't switch settings. We're still in the interrogation room. There's absolutely no time jump. The reader stayed present in that moment in that scene. But there was a purpose for that POV switch. For the detective, the scene was over. She got her confession, but for the suspect, a new scene, one in which he went from being an innocent man accused of murder to a confessed murderer who's really covering for his daughter, that scene has just begun. Do you see the key here? They each had a scene arc. Every time you start a scene in a new character's POV, there has to be an arc. They have a goal, however big or small, in this scene. Maybe they get what they want, maybe they don't get what they want, or maybe something big comes along to distract them and suddenly they have a much bigger problem and a much bigger goal to focus on. The point is, there's change. In every single scene in your novel, something should change. If there's no change, if it's just characters talking or exposition, then it's not really a scene. Imagine if, in our interrogation room example, we switched to the suspect's POV before he confessed. The detective's scene would begin and end with her questioning a guy who she thinks is a murderer. She would start the scene feeling determined but a little bit doubtful, and she would end her scene feeling determined and a little bit doubtful. There's no change. That's why that hop over to the suspect's point of view would feel jarring to the reader, because the detective scene is incomplete. To readers, scenes like that feel pointless because nothing changed. So when you're switching POVs and you're trying to figure out where to stop and start those scenes within the timeline of your novel, ask yourself these two questions. What's the moment this character takes action to achieve her goal in this scene? And what's the moment she either gets it, fails to get it, or gets interrupted by another bigger problem? And two, what's this character's emotional state at the beginning of the scene, and what is it at the end of the scene? If it's the same emotion at the beginning of the scene as it is at the end of the scene, then either this scene isn't finished or this character doesn't need a POV scene after all. What if two or more POV characters are in the same scene together? Again, this all comes down to who your narrator is. Let's keep going with this interrogation room example and let's give them names. We have Detective Kathy Shaw and the suspect Dan Bradford. Regardless of whether you're writing in first or third person, your POV character should use their own words to describe both themselves and the other characters. So let's start with a really bad example. The detective stared at Bradford. I'll ask you one more time, Kathy said. She was beginning to lose her patience. Where were you the night of the fire? Sleeping. The suspect squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. I know it's not an alibi, but it's the truth. Shaw sighed. Dan waited for her to speak. He could feel a bead of sweat slowly trickling down his face. Whose POV is this in? I have no idea. First of all, there's head hopping. You can see where we get Kathy's POV as she tells us internally that she's losing her patience. But a few lines later, we get Dan's POV as he feels sweat trickle down his face. And the character names are all over the place. Just in this super short snippet, two characters are referred to as by their first names and their last names, and the detective and the suspect. I think new writers do this sometimes when they fear being repetitive, but listen to me. Repetitiveness is not always a bad thing. When it comes to character names, you want to be repetitive. Your reader at the beginning of the novel is trying to keep all of these characters straight in their minds. And when you switch it up and call them by their first name or their last name or a nickname, you just make it harder for the reader to keep track of everything. Pick a name, use that name and the appropriate pronoun. Just keep it simple. So let's take this little snippet and let's make some decisions. I want to write this from the detective's point of view. Is she going to be Kathy or is she going to be Shaw? Either is fine, just pick one and be consistent. This is a seasoned detective. She's used to her colleagues calling her Shaw and she's on the job right now, so I'm gonna go with Shaw. Now, would she, as the narrator, refer to herself as the detective? That feels oddly distant and detached to me, more like an omniscient narrator. So I would say no. My first change to this snippet is going to be to make Shaw consistent throughout. Okay, now how does Shaw describe or think of the suspect? Would she think of him as the suspect? Yeah, I think she would. And then what about Dan or Bradford? I feel like it'd be weird for a detective to be on a first name basis with her suspect, so let's go with Bradford. Finally, we gotta fix that head hop. These last two lines of Dan's here, they need to be from Shaw's perspective. They need to be her observations of him. So let's see what we ended up with. Shaw stared at Bradford. I'll ask you one more time, she said. She was beginning to lose her patience. Where were you the night of the fire? Sleeping. Bradford squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. I know it's not an alibi, but it's the truth. Shaw sighed. The suspect watched her, a bead of sweat slowly trickling down his face. Now this is from the detective's POV. So let's go back to that original messy POV-less version and see if we can make some changes to make this from the suspect's POV. So first of all, as a narrator, would this guy refer to himself as Dan or Bradford? I'm gonna go with Dan. He's a suspect of a murder that he didn't commit. I feel like calling him by his first name just makes him feel a little bit more vulnerable as a character. Now, does he think of the detective as the detective? Yes. But also, does he call her Kathy or Shaw or maybe Detective Shaw? Probably not Kathy, but Shaw or Detective Shaw would work. It all depends on Dan's personality. I'm gonna go with Detective Shaw. And then of course, there's the head hopping. Kathy can't tell us, the reader, that she's losing her patience because we're in Dan's point of view. So Dan has to observe it. And he could tell the reader, the detective looks as though she's losing her patience. There's nothing wrong with that. But while we're fixing this up, let's try a little showing instead of telling. What does Dan observe the detective doing right now, and what can the reader infer from his observation? So here's what I ended up with in Dan's point of view. Detective Shaw stared at Dan. I'll ask you one more time, she said, squeezing her pen so hard her fingertips glowed white. Where were you the night of the fire? Sleeping. Dan squirmed uncomfortably in his chair. I know it's not an alibi, but it's the truth. Detective Shaw sighed. Dan waited for her to speak. He could feel a bead of sweat slowly trickling down his face. So there you go. It's the same scene, the same dialogue is being exchanged, but these are from two very different points of view. There's a lot more we could do to improve this writing, but at least now we know whose head we're in. How to address other characters from one character's POV. Now, I did cover this quite a bit in that last example, but let's talk a little bit more about addressing other characters and how what you call a character might change depending on whose POV you're in. Alice gave me a very specific example in her comment. If your POV character's father is in a scene, it gets odd to always refer to him as character's father or his father, but my character would never refer to his own father as Mr. Last Name. Right, he wouldn't. So what does your character call his father? Dad, probably, or Papa, something like that? Well, he's the narrator, so whatever he calls him in dialogue is going to be what he calls him in the narration too. Dad, are you ready? Tim called. Be there in a sec, Dad replied. If you wrote this as Mr. Last Name replied or Tim's father replied, it wouldn't really be third person limited anymore. It would be omniscient. That would be a different narrator, one who is not Tim. And that narrator calls Tim's father Mr. Last Name. If you're writing from Tim's POV, then Dad is Dad. Just for kicks, let's say this scene is written from the point of view of Tim's friend Anne. She definitely wouldn't call Tim's dad Dad. She would call him Mr. Last Name or think of him as Tim's father. Let's take this exact same bit of dialogue and say this is a scene where Anne is standing in Tim's front doorway waiting for him to go, and this is just a little exchange that she witnesses between Tim and his dad. Dad, are you ready? Tim called. Be there in a sec, Mr. Last Name replied. Or Tim's dad replied, or Tim's father replied. Any of those would work from Anne's point of view. So here's today's writing workshop activity. Take part of a scene that you're working on that has 2 or more characters present, so your protagonist and a side character or 2. Presumably, this scene is already written from your protagonist's POV. Now, rewrite it from one of the side characters' POVs. How do the names change, if they change at all, because they might not? What tweaks do you have to make to avoid head hopping? How does your side character observe your protagonist's emotional state? Next week's video is going to be all about writing a series, especially if it's your very first book. I've got a lot of tips for you there, so if you haven't already subscribed and hit that notification bell, be sure you do so you know when that video goes up. And don't forget to share your writing workshop exercise in the comments below and let me know if you have any other questions about POV. If you found this video helpful, I would really appreciate if you'd hit that like button. And if you know another writer who might find this helpful, go ahead and share a link to this video with them. That's it for today. I will see you guys on Friday with a Fiction Fix It, and until then, keep writing.